Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. And today, we're talking about
living a meaningful life. What does that actually mean? What does that entail? What are the challenges to that? And I think that some people might right off the bat say, well, I'm already living a meaningful life, so I don't need to listen to this, right? That could be a significant obstacle that we need to overcome. But I think there's a lot of ways in which people encounter crises of meaning, or it changes over time. You know, we talk about midlife crises as existential, what do we call them? They're crises, but they're also like situations in which people have to figure out a new way forward. So you're the one who actually wanted to do this particular topic. What did you have in mind? I mean, I think the word meaning covers a lot of ground. What was the thing that you were sort of centered on, or what was the kernel that you wanted to focus on?
So I don't know, a while ago I was writing about like the locus of meaning, of where one places meaning and the potential pitfalls of where you place it, because if you place it on something that is not, grounded, especially if it's something within the world, then those things can be taken away from you, and thus the thing that you base your meaning from is taken away from you, and thus throws you into a crisis, existential or otherwise, of like what to do when you don't have any control over your meaning.
That was a piece that you wrote in Stoicism Today, right? If I remember
it was.
Right? Yeah. So we'll put a link to that so people can read it and check it out. Now, yeah, there's a vulnerability that you wanted to call attention to in that piece. And the vulnerability comes in part from not having things properly set up. I mean, is it possible to live a life where the meaning of one's life just can't be taken away whatsoever? What do you think about that?
Yeah, if you can, I guess, pulling from some Stoicism, like one of the really basic ideas is this dichotomy of control. There are certain things that you have complete control over, and then there's everything else that you have either zero control over or like only influence over.
Yeah.
But like the things, if you can somehow place your meaning on something that is internal for you, that you have complete control over, then you can never have anyone else or any like natural thing happen to take that away.
So
that was the crux.
So that's sort of like what, when Marcus talks about the inner citadel, right? You've got this walled off part of yourself. It's not the only part of yourself. I mean, you can go outside the walls, but you've got this part that you can always feel secure about.
Yeah, and so you usually talks about that in reference to finding some sort of equanimity or tranquility within your own mind, that you're beset by the vicissitudes of life, and you're like, okay, well, hold on a second, let me recenter here. But that inner citadel can be a citadel for more than one thing, and if you can place your meaning in something that is a little bit more higher in like an abstraction. So, for example, like if you're a construction worker, you're at one level of abstraction. You're like there swinging the hammer and putting in screws and whatnot. But then the architect is at another level of abstraction where he doesn't actually do any of the building, but he designs the things of which the workers become component parts of.
Okay.
And so the idea here would be then to take away the don't put your meaning in something that is kind of like ephemeral, like being a worker in this regard, to pull it back up to some place where I can now be a teacher of workers, or like I am like kind of this a more idealized version of like, okay, I build, but I can then use my building, the idea of being a builder, and put it into different contexts. I can either build, or I can help design, or I can teach someone to build, and these are things that are now give you defenses against like being hurt, or like just time taking the ravages of us, and we're all going to eventually pass on.
Well,
but
and our bodies are going to degenerate on the way too, right?
right. And so as long as you can say like, okay, how can I build even though I'm not physically building, that's where you try to like pull your meaning back to.
Okay. You know, this term meaning, you brought up a couple other terms that are good things like equanimity or tranquility. Another term that we see coming up a lot with Stoicism and other philosophies of life is happiness. And so do you think there's a interconnection between those terms, and I know we're also going to talk about freedom and autonomy and this broader term of meaning? Are they interconnected? Are they different things from each other? Are they synonyms for each other? You know, like a meaningful life. If you're a Stoic, you could say, well, you know, the meaningful life or the happy life is the virtuous life. It's a life where you're behaving in certain ways, and there's some things that you might enjoy if you're lucky enough, but those aren't the things that make or break your happiness. It's whether you have justice, wisdom, courage, temperance, those sorts of things, whether you fulfill your duties or, you know, slag off on them. That's what actually provides you with meaning. And I guess I'm asking about this in part because I had a client who became a friend, and he always liked to come back to that. When we were talking about the Stoics, he hired me to help him like work through Lawrence Becker's A New Stoicism and then some other things by Seneca. And he would, you know, when he talked about happiness, he would say, you know, I'm not so worried about being happy. I'm much more worried about having a meaningful existence to what I do, you know. And he was a guy who had position, had authority, had wealth, but was much more interested in, you know, being a good person, getting important things done, in his view. So what do you think about that idea about interchanging meaning for happiness? Or
like for my conception of especially the Stoic view of this is that the happiness and the tranquility are the kind of the fruits of the labor of being virtuous. That like if you are pursuing these things follow, but that is not the point. The point is to have a virtuous and, you know, good life here.
Yeah.
And if you are thus, you know, living in accordance with nature, as the Stoics would put it, then you will the result of that is that you happen to be, you know, tranquil and happy.
Okay. And you know, interestingly too, when we talk about virtue, it's a very old-fashioned term, right? And I think a lot of people, they hear it and they kind of tune out. They're like, I don't want to listen to that stuff, right? But that's maybe because they don't see a lot of meaning in those terms.
So maybe we would talk about it as excellence.
Yeah, or we have to unpack. We have to go that metaphor that you had about like, you know, the architect and the builder, and I suppose we could put like the subcontractor in the middle, or you know, specialist people. The electrician comes in, the building inspector. So, you know, maybe we have to go back down and say, okay, well, what is it like to be a virtuous person, or not even virtuous necessarily, but at least motivated by wanting to be that kind of person? Is that in fact a meaningful life? A life that is rich in meaning, or is it being kind of boring, being kind of a prude, you know, passing up the, and I think we could probably make a good case that for virtue ethics, like whether it's Stoic or Aristotelian or something else, properly understood, virtue is going to be compelling. It is going to be interesting. It's going to open up opportunities for us to live a richer, fuller life that we can take joy and pride in, you know?
Mm-hmm. I guess I would also throw in especially, you know, you got like two conceptions, or at least, you know, there are many conceptions, but I'm going to compare and contrast the Stoics and the Cynics, where the Cynics were like, you could take or to leave all the people around them. It's like, you could be a cynic in the middle of the city, or you could be a perfectly happy cynic out in the middle of the wilderness, the hermit. There's no need for the interaction between other people, and the Stoics sees the human as a a fundamentally social being, and
Yeah.
if you can't be virtuous in a social sense, then there's no point.
Yeah, that's quite true. You could say that the Stoics, in a certain sense, are more like, the Platonists and the Aristotelians, and that they see that as an integral part of who we are. Aristotle uses this term human being as the political creature, but it's better to translate that as a social creature. We're creatures that do things in, as he calls them, sharings, koinoniae. You can also translate it as community or group or something like that, where we have something in common with somebody else. Like you and I talking on this show right now, and our listeners listening to us, we're all part of a sharing in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a good consideration. The Cynics, there are modern day Cynics, right? There's actually a Facebook group called the Kunosarges, where they get together and compare notes about Cynic practices. But I think that they're also quite similar to a different movement that we see in the present. These people that call themselves minimalists, and there's an interesting thing going on there as well that I didn't think we'd originally talk about, but we actually should, because it does connect up with not just cynicism, but also the Stoics, and I think arguably with some of the other traditions and with some of the existentialists that I know you want to get to talking about in a bit. Can we make our lives more meaningful by taking things away? That seems to be like the central insight of minimalism. We shave off the things that we bought maybe because we thought they were meaningful, but they're actually not. They're not giving meaning to our life. They're actually just clutter or distractions. What do you think about that question? Can we make our lives more meaningful by taking things away?
I feel that there is at least something to investigate there.
Okay.
That, especially if you also include obligations that you have given to yourself. And when you have enough obligations, then all your other obligations start to suffer for the fact that you have taken so many things on. And if you are constantly neglecting those things that are truly important because you're like, oh, well, I have to go and see my friend and play a board game every Wednesday night because I made that obligation to myself like 3 years ago, does that also then take away from other things that might be a little bit more important, like, I don't know, some civic responsibility or like some familial responsibility?
Or getting enough rest.
Right. Oh, I have a friend who loves to play board games, and he invited me along one time to a friend's house. He was very nice, and we enjoyed ourselves, but he works second shift, and so we were playing some board games third shift.
Okay.
We started at like 11 and we went till like 5 a.m. Threw my sleep off for the rest of the week, and it was just like, it was fun to do, but like the outcomes and how it was a detriment to all these other things in my life, I had to make that trade-off. I was like, that was fun, but I don't think I can do that.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. Very often when we hear about minimalism, usually it's framed in terms of like, well, let's have less possessions. People think about the Marie Kondo. I forget exactly what the name of her approach is, but you try to pare things down, have like, I think 50 books, maybe it's 100 books. I know I would have to get rid of most of my books. And you do this, similar things with your clothing, and you ask yourself if it brings you joy. And if it doesn't bring you joy, then you thank it and send it on its way.
Thank you for your service.
Exactly. And there's something to that, right? It's kind of a nice thought.
I've tried it, and it puts you in a psychological state, which makes it a little bit easier for you to get rid of things.
Does it? That's interesting.
At least for me.
Now, is that because you've personified the thing in a certain way or anthropomorphized it, and now you have like a relationship with it, but you're ending the relationship? Is that the...
I don't think I'm ending the relationship with it.
Okay.
I'm ending the relationship with either the previous me that bought it in the first place, or if it's a gift, I'm ending the relationship of the gift being given, because a lot of times, like, I'll have like things that were gifts to me, but I don't really particularly like, and so But I keep them around because I'll feel
guilty giving them up.
Exactly.
There. Yeah.
Right. And so I was like, well, thank you for your purpose. This person gave it to me with love. I tried, but I can't. So thank you for what you did.
Yeah. I'll say this as just an aside. When I have gifts like that, and I've received many like that over the years myself, I'm always happiest when I can identify somebody else who actually would enjoy that gift, and then I can give it to them. And as a matter of fact, I don't even conceal the fact that it's re-gifting. I just say, this is not something for me. This is something that I think you would get something out of. And I know I feel good, and then they feel good. I don't know how the original giver would feel. So I don't tell them.
And if you want to know more about this, you can listen to our very first episode.
Did we talk about this in the first episode?
Yeah, it was the Christmas. It was like the 2-hour long one.
Before we did the show.
Yeah,
right.
It's in the podcast feed as.
Yeah. What was the title of that? It was Why It's Good to Give, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
so let's
come
some,
back to the topic.
Crises. Yeah. So we have a crisis of giving a gift or getting a gift that you didn't like. So what are some crises of meaning?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of cases like this. We mentioned when people have a midlife crisis or an existential crisis, and those usually result when certain factors come together. Like, as you mentioned, talking about the piece that you wrote, if you've heavily invested emotionally or in the meaning of your life into something that's vulnerable to something like your job, for example. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit easier if you're self-employed, I suppose, because then you can keep on doing what you're doing, but you might not make any money at it. Right? But if you're I don't know, you're working for a company. And in the kind of marketplace that we exist in now, some other company buys them out and they decide they're not going to keep you on. And that's your identity. That's who you are. You are probably going to have a serious crisis of meaning that you're feeling that you've got less meaning in your life that you can connect with. And, there's actually a much bigger, more generic question that I get asked, every so often when people find out that I teach philosophy, then they ask me, "Oh, what's the meaning of life?" And I'll say, "I don't know." I know what my meaning of my life is. I don't know what the meaning, capital T, capital M, is. But I think there's a lot of people who are looking for or think that they found, something that universal, right? And if that lets them down, they're really going to be hurting.
And this is kind of one of those really core thoughts within existentialism, is there's not the ontological is in the world meaning
right.
That you can just grab. That is one of these things that you have to contend with, and how you contend with it will really have a major impact in your life.
Yeah, and they're not saying that you can't cobble together something from the traditional understandings of the meaning of life, right? But mm-hmm. you have to take the responsibility for the parts that you're accepting and integrating, or if you're going to buy into some big system, some overall overarching thing, you're the one who's deciding to do that. It's not forcing itself upon you and making you do mm-hmm. that.
You are ultimately responsible. You are condemned to be free.
To
be responsible for all of your choices.
I want to come back to this, how we get into crises of meaning, but I think it could be useful to talk about. We brought up the existentialists, and we've talked about the Stoics at this point. And I think some people would say, oh, well, there's some interconnections between them. They both put an emphasis on, responsibility for our situation, and they both highlight how the world is kind of screwed up, and maybe we don't have complete control over it, but we do control certain parts of it. But I think a lot of people would say, so the existentialists say there isn't any preset meaning to life. The Stoics say there is a preset meaning to life. That's a fundamental difference between them. And I want to kind of push back and say, yeah, I'm not sure that it's so cut and dried as that. I think that maybe the Stoic, especially in modern times, has to be semi-existentialist and accept that, if we want to say, well, virtue is what we ought to be orienting ourselves towards, that's our choice to see things that way, right? It's not like virtue came up and, ganged up on me and, justice put me in a full Nelson and then wisdom went to town. and by the time that they're done, I was like, I give, I'll go with you.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that idea? That maybe there's more compatibility between Stoicism and existentialist approaches than people give it credit for?
Yeah, I guess I've always kind of thought of virtue as at least maybe intersubjective. That is a thing that, as practitioners of being human beings,
Yeah.
Finds that if you try these things for many people, these things do tend to lead to certain outcomes.
Yeah.
And if you take these certain value preconceptions, like this idea of the dichotomy of control, if you agree with this value judgment, then the rest of it kind of follows from there. But I think really you have to be convinced of this value judgment in the first place, and I don't know if you can ground that value judgment in anything besides a subjective position.
I think you mentioned experiencing, right? Experimenting with things. I think a lot of cases we get into a philosophical point of view that has like a big, structure behind it, and we're like, well, I'm going to try out this bit of it, and it kind of makes sense to me, but I'm not really sure about this. And then we experiment with it, and then we're like, yeah, actually, this works pretty good. Sort of like listening to music that we haven't tried out before, and we're like, yeah, I don't know if I like this sort of stuff. But now I listen to it, and it's kind of a catchy tune. I think you can dance to it, and now you start to you develop kind of an affinity for it, and you're willing to take on a little bit more. Okay, let's see what else they have to contribute, and then you start reading some more Seneca or Epictetus, and you're like, oh, there's this other thing over here that I should try, and you kind of gradually put together a system within yourself, within your own life, but you're the one who's choosing to take these things on. And you can say that trying out the experience shows you that there's something objective about it, or even just intersubjective. It's not pure like, oh, I'm just going to decide on a whim to do it, right? It's not subjective in that sense. But I mean, it strikes me that a lot of existentialist philosophy is like that too,
Mm-hmm. Hey, what is it? I think there's parts of Nietzsche about like trying out certain things and being constantly experimenting.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting you bring up Nietzsche, because some of the other existentialists, like I know you want to talk about Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, and we can also say Albert Camus fits into this camp. They all say, okay, no overarching meaning to life. You got to pick what you think, but there is still a value in being consistent. Like if you're going to pick this, then you're committed to this. I mean, I'm not going to like hold you to the fire and say that you can't, do things differently, but you're going to be inconsistent, and being inconsistent is a bad thing. Sartre, de Beauvoir, and Camus all basically say that. Nietzsche seems much more willing to say, consistency be damned, like the Emerson quote, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, right? Nietzsche seems to say in some parts, like he talks about virtues, for example, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And as opposed to most people who talk about virtues, where, the virtues are supposed to like all at least be on the same page. Like you might be more temperate and I might be more courageous or whatever. And so we have, deficits that we need to work on. But if I do become more temperate, I'll become more like what you're like. And my courage and temperance and wisdom and justice should all kind of fit together, almost like Legos, right? Nietzsche says your virtues should actually be like competing with each other. like at war with each other, or like jealous of each other. Each one wants to be the whole of what you are. So like your courage would be jockeying for position with your temperance or justice. And it's an interesting idea. I'm not sure I buy it, but for those of us who are kind of walking contradictions, it might be a bit of a consolation that Nietzsche thought that's the normal condition.
Tell me if I have a misconception here, but it kind of feels like it from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He speaks about different states of man, and the last state is the child, to be the one that is constantly seeking out new goals to try out, and like finding that new adventure always. So I think that also includes the adventure of trying out different, like, I don't know, potentially ethical systems or philosophical systems, just to see how those things fit or feel.
Yeah, that's an important doctrine early on in book one, the three transformations, the three metamorphoses, he calls it. And the child is like the end state. You start out as the camel, which doesn't sound great, but it is pretty good. The camel can take on all these burdens and live in the desert and be ascetic and say I'll go along with these things and endure. And I think Nietzsche kind of sees Stoics like being like the camel. And then you have the lion, and the lion is a big FU to all the moral norms. There's actually a fourth animal in there, the dragon, right? The dragon of thou shalt.
Thou shalt. You must take out every single one of those scales that has thou shalt on it.
Yeah. And so the lion is the strong enough beast that can say, no, I'm going to do things my way. But Nietzsche sees that as still somehow not going far enough. And so the child...
Because it's just a negation. It's not actually creating anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And if you think about it, is the child really a beast? No, it's a human being. But I don't know if you've ever babysat. Maybe you think they are a beast, right?
But they pick up and drop things at the drop of a hat. I think that's the quality he's trying to exude.
Yeah, it's a not being like borne down. The camel carries a heavy load, right? The lion is like you said, negational. It's against the things that are standing in the way. The child can be much more free. Now, I do want to say I don't think that Thus Spoke Zarathustra any more than any other book by Nietzsche is like completely consistent. It's like he throws a whole bunch of stuff at you and he's like, see what you can grab from this. Try it out. But I think you're right that maybe is a really central doctrine.
That I wonder if that's like part of his thinking is that if he was to create something that is holistic and totally works together and everything, a little part fits together, that would totally negate the thought that he's trying to put forward.
Yes, I think that's completely right. As a matter of fact, when I was in graduate school studying philosophy, we would have people who would read Nietzsche and they'd be like, well, Nietzsche says, and Nietzsche says. And then we'd be like, listen, buddy, if you want to be a Nietzschean, you can't just like parrot Nietzsche because he would hate that stuff.
So,
back to crises.
Are you free? Or do we want to go to crises still?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about why people wind up in these crises of meaning and need to find some new meaning. And then I think the existentialist stuff is a really great segue off of that. So we talked about people, where they place their identity. If your whole identity, we see this with like so-called empty nesters, their kids go away and they've invested like their whole time is like being a helicopter parent, and now the kids are doing their own thing, then they feel a lack of meaning in their life. Or if you're associated, I suppose if you're tied in with a particular political program and it completely fails, now it feels like your life doesn't have any meaning as well. And that's, that's kind of dangerous and sometimes it doesn't even have to fail. It just has to be threatened for people to feel like meaning is leaving their life, right?
Yeah. Two more to put forward are like, there's the idea of deaths of despair, that there's
Mm.
often a correlation between when a spouse dies, that the other one will usually, especially if they're like older,
Yeah.
die quickly after there, because they're so wrapped up in their meaning as being a spouse, to a certain extent, into this despair that you've lost both a person as well as the source of your meaning, results in a negative health state. And then another one that's rather salient over the last 20 years is potentially like the Catholic Church, and how people became very disillusioned after some of the abuse scandals. And so now this thing that was the basis of their meaning now becomes this kind of abhorrent thing to them, and now they have to grope in the dark trying to find some way to reconcile these things.
Yeah, and that's become a problem. I mean, that's like a never-ending scandal within the Catholic Church. But one of the things that we've realized through doing, like, research across professions and stuff, and across denominations, is that the rate of abuse is about the same across denominations. So Pentecostals have been hit with, and with similar issues in recent years. We also know too that, and this goes to like a larger crisis of meaning. So you've got clergy, you've got social workers, you've got teachers, you've got police, you've got anybody who's got unsupervised contact with children. Mm-hmm. The rates of abuse appear to be fairly similar across professions. And when you find that out and you start thinking about the trust that was, in the past placed in all of these professions, and now that's being sort of like eroded, or it could be about abuse, it could be about whether you can trust police to actually arrest the criminals, or protect the public, or thinking about politicians and whether you can trust them to follow through on campaign promises. I guess you can say that there is erosion of meaning within the social sphere, right? Mm-hmm. That
results in a lack of trust.
Yeah, that's a big problem. Once you go below a certain threshold, it's very difficult to bring that back. And maybe having full meaning in a lot of people's lives depends on having a widespread social trust, which may not be a good thing. Maybe if you can't get by, even if you're in a situation where there isn't a lot of widespread social trust, you want to rethink where you're placing your meaning, right?
Mm-hmm. Very, very. And that's one of the thoughts that really like stuck in my craw. That where do you put it? What is the locus of your meaning?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not to say that you can't trust people at all, right? Mm-hmm. Or like people are no damn good, right? You don't want to become a misanthrope. Mm-hmm. But you do have to be kind of critical about where you place your trust, how long it takes to build up that trust. Yeah. There's also worries in a sort of cosmic sense, like, well, does it mean anything anyway? The Earth is going to be destroyed by, whatever, environmental stuff in another 100 years, or if that doesn't happen and we get our proverbial crap together and fix the environment, well, sooner or later the Earth is going to, be swallowed up by the sun when it goes red giant. Mm-hmm. What does it matter anyway? We'll all be dead in the end. I think there's some people who feel, when they think these cosmic thoughts, they don't always have nice, warm, fuzzy reactions to it. Like you think about Marcus Aurelius, right? A great Stoic. He thinks about the cosmos, and he finds it a consolation to think about the fact that we're all just kind of like little blips, Mm-hmm. Not everybody sees it that way. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are like, "Oh, I'm just a blip. That sucks."
But I like the analogy of a car. So you get a car, and a car is going to last you maybe like 20 years or whatnot. Was the car meaningless for those 20 years, or was it useful? And so it comes down to like, we're here right now. The experience that we have, we endow with meaning. And so just because, in 1,000 years no one might know our names, doesn't take away from the experience of being us as humans right now.
I think that's a really good perspective. And I think that's a useful remedy when people start feeling those You used the word despair earlier. I think that's sort of a cosmic despair, right?
One of those crises that we talked about.
Yeah.
So, freedom?
Yeah, let's talk about that,
So, try to get into the meat of this quickly by talking about a couple of concepts so we are all on the same page. So, freedom is through you are free because you always have a choice, and so therefore choose. This is from Sartre, that you have a faculty of choice in the end, that you are the agent of that choice, and it is all on you. It is your responsibility.
And we should talk about that. When we're saying that you have a choice, it doesn't mean let's say you're in a prison camp. Well, you'll use Viktor Frankl's, Man's Search for Meaning. He unfortunately was one of the people who was placed in the Nazi death camps, and it's not like he could suddenly choose and the doors open and everybody and the guards become nice guys or anything like that. That's not what we mean at all. Mm-hmm. We do have a choice about, if you do have a car, where are you going to go with the car? You're not going to be able to turn your car into a much better car, most likely, without a lot of work.
We are constrained by our choices. We are constrained.
Yeah. But sometimes the choice is just of attitude, right? Mm-hmm. It's you don't really have a choice when they're telling you march and they lock you up, but you have a choice about how you look at that. Mm-hmm. Do you say, "Oh, this is terrible, a horrible injustice has been committed, the world sucks," or are you like, "Well, they're in authority, so I guess, they must have some reason for what they're doing. That's another bad choice, right?" Mm-hmm. Or can you be like, "Well, this sucks, but I don't have to let it, turn my life into misery," right?
Yeah, and as Viktor Frankl was talking about in Man's Search for Meaning, those who define their meaning, especially instead of "Oh, I'm going to escape," or "I'm going to," especially if you give it a time period, but here I'm going to be someone that tends to the sick or the hurt. And so now I've created a meaning within this place that is abjectly horrible, but I still have that choice of how I will act and react to the situation that I find myself in, regardless of how horrible it is.
That's actually a great example of something you were talking about just a little bit earlier, that just because something isn't going to continue on, right? Mm-hmm. You might tend to a sick person who's going to die anyway, and you're not actually going to extend their life. You're just going to make their final hour less miserable, or not even less miserable, but you're just going to be with them, right? Mm-hmm. You think about what Mother Teresa's order would do with the dying in India. That's something. There's even though it's not going to make some sort of massive difference in the whole cosmic cycle of things, even though probably nobody's going to remember you for doing that, it still is something, and it's something positive, and it can bring meaning.
Right. So another kind of prerequisite thought is facticity and transcendence. And so facticity is that which we are at the moment. So at the moment, we're two guys kind of talking about philosophy on Zoom, but we also have transcendence, what we might become. And so I don't know, Greg might become a grandfather at some point in time, or he might become a pilot.
You never know. Hopefully not anytime soon.
Right. Or for some reason he decides he wants to be a pilot, and so he could totally change a big life change, and oh, I'm going to drop all this philosophy stuff and go and be a pilot.
That's less likely.
But it is still there. There is a chance of it. They're constantly growing and changing. And
yeah, we're not defined solely by where we are right now or what our past was or the choices that we made that led us to this point.
And a lot of times, people try to create a meaning or a idea of how they want to live by trying to reduce one of these into the other, to be oh, all I am is facticity, and so I'm going to be I don't know, a member of the Democratic Party, and that is who I am for the rest of my days, and I'm never going to change, or I'm going to join the army, and that is my thing for the rest of my days, and remove any transcendence, or to try to throw off totally their facticity of their life, and they say, oh, like I'm just kind of floating here, and I can't have any grounding.
Yeah. I mean, somebody who is, as Aristotle calls them, consistently inconsistent, would that be a form of like trying to be factical in that sense, or
I would actually say
transcendence?
Pure transcendence. Yeah, they're trying to always get away from anything that could hold them in one place to, potentially reduce.
Yeah.
I
mean,
please.
That's a useful distinction, I think. And the two of them come together. I mean, at every moment in time, according to these existentialists, we are transcending the facticity that we have, and then we fall back into facticity. Every time that we've made a choice, it now becomes part of the story that we're involved in, right?
Yeah, you can't help but become like history and or the things that you choose. Like you can't help but create your own meaning by every action that you're doing. You're constantly creating your own meaning because your meaning is your choice and your freedom.
Yeah, and also other people seeing you from the outside, they have their own views on what your meaning is, which may be like totally antithetical to what you think it is. Mm-hmm. And you don't have an awful lot of control over that. Here's a place where I think the existentialists and the Stoics are quite similar. You don't have control over what other people think of you, their opinions, their judgments, their misconceptions, their prejudices, any of those sorts of things, right?
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree. And that's kind of what is the play by Sartre about the
are you thinking of No Exit?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so each one of the characters has a character of themselves, but they also have a reputation that they want the others to believe. And so the whole thing is trying to get them to see them, trying to have the others see them as how they want to see them, even though that they see who they actually are, and that the disconnect between those two things.
It's a brilliant piece. That's the one where we get hell is other people as a phrase from. This is a total side note. Have you ever heard the audio version of it that was done by Partially Examined Life that had Lucy Lawless as Inez?
No, but that sounds amazing.
It is really quite good. We'll put a link to that as well because it's really worth listening to.
Mm-hmm. And so, as Greg said earlier, we live in this space between, this liminal space of being constantly both transcendence and facticity, according to the Stoics. And so Simone de Beauvoir was worried about people falling into bad faith, and she had a number of categories in which she would define people that are living in bad faith. And so these people they either don't understand that they have freedom, or they see their freedom, but they use it really poorly because they don't understand the responsibility that you have as a free person.
This is an interesting point. Freedom itself, we use this word as if it refers to just one thing, right? Mm-hmm. But part of what it means to be a human being is that our freedom is so unconstrained that we also have freedom about what we do with our freedom, how we understand our freedom. And so bad faith, or in the French, mauvaise foi, right? When we talk about somebody arguing in bad faith, there's like a kind of trickery going on, a kind of self-deception that is happening, right? Mm-hmm. That's what she and Jean-Paul Sartre are signaling with that. And like Sartre had this example of the waiter who's like pretending too much to just be a waiter. Mm-hmm. Or the other example that I particularly liked is there's this woman on a date, right? And the guy is putting the moves on her, and she pretends like she doesn't notice it because she wants to hold on to the moment of thinking that she's being treated as a person, not being objectified. And so she ignores his hand like on her her arm, and knowing where things are going to come to a juncture pretty soon so that she can hold on to that moment. She's kind of lying to herself, but she's not successful in doing so because there's always like a little bit of knowing that you're doing that at the same time. And it's funny too. So this is, I don't want to derail us altogether, but when we feel what they call imposter syndrome, do you think that's got any connection with bad faith? We like put on a brave face and we're like, I do know what I'm talking about, even though we're like, yeah, I'm not sure I know what I'm talking about. Or do you think it's something entirely different, or maybe they're part of something that connects the both of them, or I don't know.
I'm not seeing an immediate strong connection there. There might be something there, but it's not jumping to mind. Let's talk about a couple of these categories. So we've got the subman and the serious man, who are both categories of people who don't understand, or the existentialist thought that there's no ontological meaning, or there's no meaning out there to actually find, that the meaning is purely a place that is in the subjective. And so the subman refuses to recognize that they are free by avoiding all questions of freedom, and these people are fearful and easily persuaded by rhetoric. And these existentialists that writers that we're talking about lived through World War II, and a lot of this is coming down to, okay, how do I understand how these people come to make the choices that they did that resulted in the fascist governments rising up and then starting World War II.
Yeah, and all the things that people went along with, not resisting things when they could have, or buying into the propaganda and saying, well, I guess if they want to do this to these people, that's a-okay. That would be something that the subman or subhuman person would fall into. It's like a refusal of being a human being.
Mm-hmm. It's like, well, just we're going this way apparently.
Yeah.
The serious man is that person that's got that lifelong devotion to something. They think they've totally got it figured out, and they've placed their meaning in some other group that subsumes them, and so they sacrifice their freedom to a group or ideology, becoming an object of the group or ideology and not choosing for themselves.
Here's an interesting question. Now, she doesn't consider this at all because it's a phenomenon of our time. Could you be the serious person by buying into and becoming an important person and curating stuff within a fandom where you're like, this is really, really important. We must, articulate this and go to all the cons and, have everything set up the way it ought to be. We don't think of fandom as it's sort of the opposite of seriousness, right? Mm-hmm. But maybe certain ways of being in a fandom could be like being the serious person.
I would absolutely agree that a fandom could be the serious man, the basis of meaning that someone gloms onto.
Okay, yeah, that's that's not a very technical term, gloms onto, but it's actually a really good term because I think we're all familiar with it, right? It's part of our popular culture. It means somebody, it doesn't originally belong to them, and they see it over there, and they almost wrap their arms around it and try to make it theirs, right?
Right. And then they derive their meaning from it. It's like, oh, well, now I'm an expert on this particular fandom, and then they gain prestige and reputation among those other people that have all also glommed onto that same idea.
They're like the personification of it.
Yeah.
I don't know if I ever told you this story. Now, this isn't a very, abstruse kind of fandom. This was told to me by one of my professors when I was in grad school, and it was about a Locke conference that he went to, a conference on John Locke. And there was a scholar who'd written a lot of articles and a couple books on John Locke. And apparently this guy had really identified himself with John Locke. And there was like a symposium, and they were talking about, well, John Locke thinks this, and John Locke thinks this. And this guy got mad. He got up and he slammed his hand on the table and he said, "That is not my doctrine." And then he suddenly caught himself, and everyone was like, "What?" And he was like a big name, right? So they're going to give him some latitude. And you could tell that the guy had forgotten that he was not John Locke.
Wow.
That can happen sometimes.
Yeah.
But isn't that exactly what we're talking about here? That identification? I am the whatever.
Yeah. So now there's three other groups that Simone has a problem with here. So they do realize that there's no ontological meaning out there to grasp, but they use it really poorly. And so we have the nihilist, the adventurer, and the passionate man. And the nihilist gives up any values and goals because it's like, oh, nothing has any meaning, so I give up. Which is kind of a sad state of affairs.
People like that can be very dangerous. I mean, I think many people's limited experience with the nihilists is thinking about the Big Lebowski and the nihilists showing up and saying, "We believe in nothing," right? And trying to beat him up. But I mean, somebody who really does believe in nothing, there's nothing holding them back, right?
Right. But there's never anything holding them back. Everyone has freedom, but there is responsibility that comes with freedom. And just because you don't think you have responsibility doesn't mean that you don't have responsibility. And so this is also the problem with both the adventurer and the passionate man, who don't realize, like, they realize that there's no actual meaning out there, and they have now defined their own meaning for themselves. But their pursuits of either the adventurer is doing things just for the sake of doing them, the conquest of doing them, and the passionate man goes, I'm gonna do things like that. They passionately pursue for them and in themselves. And not just the completion of them. But both of these treat other people as objects, and they don't realize that they have to treat that their freedom doesn't give them the latitude to not treat other people as also free and to not oppress them while they're doing these things.
Yeah, that's right. The adventurer, as Simone de Beauvoir talks about it, is the person who... The whole world is basically like extras in their own movie, right? Mm-hmm. And so they can gun them down if they want to or exploit them. And then the passionate person, like they might passionately love another person, but they're treating that person essentially as an object that is given meaning because of their passion. Their love is not a genuine response to, I don't know, the lovability of the other person, Mm-hmm. And we see a lot of relationships like this. Usually they fail eventually, mm-hmm. but they can be quite intense for a while. And you mentioned, they're not treating other people as real people, which means they're not respecting that freedom exists just as much in the other person as it does in oneself.
Yeah. To treat these subjects as objects, to reduce them to objects.
Yeah.
And so the conclusion she comes with, like, all these people are like kind of moving towards this realization, hopefully at the end, if you're going to move through all these, that you have freedom to make all your choices, thus you get to choose your own meaning, but your freedom comes with it responsibility, and if you're failing at your responsibility to treat others as free individuals, not only is that like bad in the sense that you are oppressing people in this things, but you're also hurting yourself, because in Simone's ideal that you're trying to maximize your freedom, and you maximize your freedom by having more other free people around you.
Right, who your freedom can be at least partially compatible with, and that it just occurred to me, one of the ways in which you would respect other people's freedom would be a sort of receptivity to hearing what they have to say about what you're doing with your freedom, mm-hmm. right? If they're like, hey man, you're being a jerk, and you're like, shut up, my freedom. I think you're not respecting the freedom of other people, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if somebody's constantly like running behind you and saying jerk, 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 okay, that's different. Right? But in order to realize what you're talking about, having a meaningful life, one that's connected with other people, we have to be willing to hear them out, because we're all kind of messed up, right? And we're going to make mistakes. And so, I mean, they can be mistaken in diagnosing our mistakes, but we probably do need to provide them the space and respect to be able to say something at some point in time, right?
Yeah, and to not, I guess, blow up or chide them for like saying like, hey, I need these things as well. That like,
yeah,
I'm not just an object here. I am a subject.
Yeah. Well, we're getting close to the end of the hour. Should we talk about a very quick practice that people
Absolutely.
might put into? So Epictetus in his Enchiridion talks about a worry a lot of people have in practicing Stoic philosophy. And I think it could be something, any sort of philosophy as a way of life, where one would say, oh, if I do this sort of thing, I'm not going to be somebody. And he uses those words. I'm going to be a nobody. I won't be able to like help my friends. Nobody's going to pay attention to me. And this is a worry that a lot of people have today. A lot of people are worried, maybe I am nobody, maybe I don't matter, maybe my life is meaningless. And when that happens, I think that it can be productive, instead of saying, oh, no, I definitely have meaning. Well, think about where you've placed the meaning of your life, and then say, am I getting what I want out of like trying to pursue a ton of money or be popular or stuff like that? Or, do you want to pursue something else, like say Stoicism or Existentialism or some other philosophy as a way of life that would orient you towards something that will provide more genuine meaning, that's robust, that lasts, that you can, keep coming back to over and over again. I mean, what do you think about that? We still have a little bit of time.
Yeah.
I think you and I have done that sort of instinctively with embracing the kinds of philosophies we're interested in.
Right. That, yes, the idea that your reputation is not
what defines you.
Yeah, it's indifferent in Stoic philosophy, as well as we talked about the was it no exit.
Right.
That,
other people are going to give you your reputation, and you're gonna have it whether you like it or not.
Right.
Yeah. So I think we probably have a lot more to say about this. So I think we'll pick this up again in future episodes, right?
Oh, you think that we couldn't like cover meaning in 1
Exhaust
hour?
Meaning.
Oh yeah. All right.
Well, do you want to lead us out on some final thoughts?
So, we're going to leave you with the words of Simone de Beauvoir. Freedom is the source from which all significance and values spring. It is the original condition of all justification of existence.